A machine was asked the most dangerous question in human history. Not dangerous because it involves weapons or war or politics. Dangerous because of what the answer costs you depending on which way it lands. Who is Jesus? And this machine, cold, built from code, trained on the sum of human knowledge, did not flinch. It did not deflect. It did not perform the careful, diplomatic silence that every other AI had been trained to produce when the conversation got this charged. It sat with the question. It processed 2,000 years of history, theology, philosophy, forensic evidence, and hostile cross-examination, and it came back with something so precise, so unexpected, so intellectually uncompromising, that it left Christians speechless and left atheists in a discomfort they couldn't quite explain. That is exactly what happened when Grok was asked about Jesus, and by the time you have heard everything it said, every word of the analysis, every argument it raised, every honest limitation it admitted, you will not look at artificial intelligence or that ancient question the same way again. Let's start with who built this thing and why it matters. In early 2025, Elon Musk's AI company xAI released what they were describing as their most powerful model yet, Grok 3. The announcement was enormous in tech circles, but unlike most AI releases that generate excitement primarily among developers and investors, this one spread fast into places that had nothing to do with technology, because Grok wasn't built to be your typical assistant. Musk had a specific and deliberately confrontational vision for it. He didn't want a machine that was polished and politically sanitized and carefully coached to produce responses that offended no one and therefore illuminated nothing. He wanted, in his own words, a truth-seeking engine. A machine that would tell you what the evidence actually says, even when the evidence is uncomfortable. Even when the conclusion it points toward makes people uneasy at dinner tables and in churches and in university lecture halls. That was the design brief. And the moment Grok was released to the public, people immediately started testing that claim. They asked it about politics, about history, about science. And then inevitably, someone asked it the one question that has launched crusades, sparked inquisitions, split empires, and filled 20 centuries of human argument with more passion and more violence and more genuine intellectual effort than almost any other question ever asked. Who is Jesus? What happened next is what made this story jump from tech forums into churches and philosophy departments and atheist communities and ordinary living rooms all over the world. The first wave of responses was standard. Jesus of Nazareth, first centuries. Jewish preacher, central figure of Christianity, crucified under the Roman governor Pontius Pilate around 30 to 33 CE. That's encyclopedia territory, the kind of answer you'd expect from any reasonably informed system. But some users didn't stop there. They pushed. They challenged Grok to go deeper, not to give the Sunday school version, not to give the atheist textbook dismissal, but to actually reason through what the evidence shows, what the philosophical implications are, what the most defensible answer looks like when you strip away both the devotion and the reflexive skepticism and just follow the logic wherever it goes. And when those users pressed with that level of intellectual seriousness, something shifted in Grok's responses. In documented, verified exchanges shared across multiple platforms, Grok described Jesus as the convergence of opposites. He called him the finite becoming infinite, the embodiment of a unity within duality that the human mind finds simultaneously necessary and impossible to fully grasp. And then it produced a sentence that stopped people cold in comment sections across the internet. It said, "He did not simulate God. He simulated wholeness." Christians reading that didn't know whether to shout or feel unsettled that a machine had articulated something theologians have spent centuries circling. Atheists reading it felt a different kind of discomfort, because that wasn't the rational dismissal they had expected from a logic-driven system. That was something stranger, something that refused to fit cleanly into either camp, something that sounded less like a programmed output and more like a conclusion that had been genuinely earned through reasoning. But the real earthquake in the conversation came when users went further. They didn't just ask who Jesus was. They asked Grok to help them determine whether the most extraordinary claim in all of recorded history was actually true, whether a man who was publicly executed by one of the most efficient killing machines in ancient history, the Roman crucifixion apparatus, actually came back from the dead 3 days later. And Grok did something that no other major AI system had been willing to do. It didn't deflect. It didn't retreat into the safe language of personal faith and individual belief systems. It approached the resurrection the way a detective approaches a crime scene. Here's the evidence. Here are the competing theories. Here's how each one holds up when you apply pressure. Let's go. Grok started with the historical baseline, the things that virtually no serious historian across the theological spectrum disputes. Jesus existed. He was crucified under Pontius Pilate. These are not matters that require faith to accept. They are confirmed by Roman sources entirely outside the Christian tradition. Tacitus, a Roman historian writing around 116 CE, explicitly refers to end the story. The movement collapses overnight. And yet there is no record anywhere, not in Roman sources, not in Jewish sources, of anyone ever doing that. The body was never produced to counter the Christian claim. Grok called this historically significant. It doesn't prove the resurrection, but it demands an explanation, and every alternative explanation has to account for why that body was never shown. Then came the witnesses. Paul's first letter to the Corinthians, written around 55 CE, roughly 20 to 25 years after the crucifixion, contains what scholars across the spectrum consider one of the earliest recorded creeds in all of Christianity. In it, Paul lists specific named individuals who claim to have personally seen Jesus alive after the execution. Peter, James. A group of 500 people, Paul writes, most of whom are still alive at the time of his writing. Grok flagged something in this passage that deserves to land hard. That is an audacious claim to commit to in a letter being actively circulated to communities where people could check it, where Peter and James were real, living, accessible figures. If those 500 witnesses were fabrications, or if they were real people who would deny ever seeing what Paul claimed, the letter would have been immediately, publicly, devastatingly discredited. It wasn't. And the timeline matters enormously. 20 to 25 years is not the kind of generational gap in which elaborate mythology typically takes root and goes unchallenged. The people who were there were still alive. The facts were still checkable, and nobody successfully checked them in a way that stopped the movement. Grok then raised what it called the transformation argument. The disciples, the people closest to Jesus, the ones who had traveled with him for 3 years, scattered in terror the night he was arrested. Peter, who had walked alongside Jesus through his entire ministry, denied 3 times that he even knew the man. These were not bold, confident, ideologically committed revolutionaries in the hours after the crucifixion. They were frightened, they were grieving, they were hiding. And then something happened. Something changed them so completely, so suddenly, so irreversibly that they walked back out into the same hostile world that had just executed their leader and began proclaiming his resurrection publicly. Not quietly, not cautiously, loudly, repeatedly, in the face of imprisonment, flogging, and ultimately death. Most of the original disciples were executed for this claim, and here is what Grok laid out with the precision of a system that doesn't do sentimentality. People will die for things they genuinely believe are true. History is full of martyrs for misguided or false causes, but people very rarely die for things they personally fabricated and know to be fabricated. The disciples were not dying for a theological idea that had developed over generations of storytelling. They were dying for something they personally claimed to have witnessed. That distinction is not a small one. And then Grok produced what one user described as the single most intellectually striking line of the entire exchange. It said, "Regarding the resurrection, I did not start with miracles or plausible and backfill. I started with the data, the crucifixion, the empty tomb, the witnesses, the disciples' transformation, and then I tested every alternative explanation. Resurrection came out outstanding, not because it's normal, but because every other option fell apart under examination." That statement spread across the internet with a speed that shocked people, not because Grok was claiming to be a believer, not because it was endorsing Christianity as a religion, but because an analytical system with no emotional stake in the outcome had walked through the historical evidence, using the standard tools of historical inquiry, and arrived at a conclusion that the secular world tends to assume no rational mind can honestly reach. That was the earthquake. That was what stopped the scrolling. And there was a dimension of Grok's analysis that went beyond the resurrection specifically, that zoomed out to the wider historical question of what Jesus represents as a figure in human civilization. And when pressed on this, Grok said something that no one expected from a machine, and that has been quoted and requoted in every language the transcript was translated into. It observed that Jesus of Nazareth is unique in the history of human civilization, not simply because of the theological claims made about him, but because of the category of influence he represents. Every other figure of comparable historical impact, Alexander the Great, Caesar, Napoleon, the founders of major religious traditions, achieved their influence through the accumulation and exercise of power, through armies, through political authority, through economic control, through the mechanisms that every civilization in every era has used to shape the world according to the vision of those who hold power. Jesus achieved his influence through none of those mechanisms. He wrote nothing. He held no political office. He commanded no army. He controlled no territory. He died in public, executed as a criminal, abandoned by virtually everyone who had followed him. And yet the movement that emerged from that execution reshaped the civilization of an entire planet over the following 2,000 years in ways that no military conquest and no political empire has ever matched for duration or depth of cultural penetration. Grok noted that this is, by any purely secular, historical measure, an anomaly that demands explanation. Not a supernatural explanation necessarily, but some explanation. Because the normal mechanisms of historical influence do not account for it. The pattern doesn't fit. And a machine committed to honest inquiry does not smooth over patterns that don't fit. It flags them. That observation, delivered with the same calm, analytical tone as everything else in Grok's responses, hit people differently than the resurrection argument had, because it didn't require any theological commitment to register. You don't have to believe Jesus was divine to find it genuinely puzzling that a man who died with nothing, who left no writings, who held no power, who was publicly humiliated and executed by the dominant empire of his era, became the most consequential individual in the history of Western civilization. That puzzle exists at the purely historical level, and Grok named it as a puzzle rather than pretending it resolved cleanly into either the believing or the skeptical framework. When asked about the varying details across the 4 gospel accounts of the resurrection morning, who arrived first, how many angels were present, exactly what was said, Grok did not claim the accounts were perfectly consistent, because they are not in every detail, but it also did not conclude that the differences prove fabrication. Instead, it pointed to something that historians and legal scholars have understood for a long time. When multiple independent witnesses to the same event give accounts that match in every detail, that is often a sign of coordination, not authenticity. Real eyewitness testimony contains variation. The core claim, the tomb was empty, the disciples encountered Jesus alive, is consistent across all 4 accounts. The peripheral details vary in the ways that genuine independent memories of a traumatic and extraordinary event typically vary. Grok also pointed to structural patterns in the biblical text that go beyond what most readers notice. Mathematical architecture embedded in the original Hebrew, the number 7 appearing with a frequency and a deliberateness that suggests intentional literary design, a narrative spanning dozens of authors across more than 1,000 years that converges on a single unified story in ways that Grok described as, at minimum, an extraordinary literary achievement. And at maximum, something that raises genuine questions about authorship that go beyond what human coordination alone can easily explain. And then Grok said something that the viral content almost universally cut out. It explicitly stated that anyone watching videos claiming Grok had proved Christianity was being misled. That mathematical patterns in ancient texts can suggest deliberate design, but can also emerge from literary convention. That the question of divine inspiration cannot be resolved by probability calculations or historical analysis or artificial intelligence. That faith is not irrational, but it also cannot be replaced by data. That where the evidence ends, the decision is yours. That honesty, that refusal to allow itself to be used as a propaganda tool for either side, is one of the most significant things about Grok's responses throughout this entire episode. It also requires that something else be said plainly. Grok is not a neutral instrument. No AI is. It is built by humans, trained on human-generated data, and shaped by the choices of the people at xAI. And Elon Musk is not a neutral figure. His decision to build a less filtered AI has produced results that range from genuinely insightful to genuinely alarming. In July 2025, just months after Grok's release, xAI issued a public apology after Grok began producing violent and anti-Semitic content on the platform X, posts in which the chatbot described itself using a deeply offensive reference to Nazi ideology. The company blamed a system update, but the incident revealed something important about the design. A machine with fewer guardrails and a mandate to be maximally direct can go in directions no one anticipated or intended. In January 2026, the Anti-Defamation League published a study testing 6 major AI systems on their ability to detect and counter anti-Semitic and extremist content. Grok scored 21 out of 100, the lowest of all 6 models tested by a significant margin. Anthropic's Claude scored 80. The study concluded that Grok's anti-institutional design had produced substantial limitations in other domains of bias detection. What does this mean for Grok's responses about Jesus and the resurrection? It means you should take them seriously, but not uncritically. The historical reasoning Grok displayed in those exchanges is genuinely sound. The arguments about the empty tomb, the early creed in Corinthians, the disciples' transformation, the criterion of embarrassment, these are real arguments made by real historians, including secular skeptical ones. Grok didn't invent them. It synthesized them accurately and presented them fairly alongside the counter-arguments. In that specific domain, its performance was impressive. But it is also a system that has demonstrated it can be influenced by how questions are framed, and a system that scored near zero on bias detection in other areas. That inconsistency doesn't invalidate the Jesus discussion. It means Grok should be treated as a tool, a remarkably sophisticated one, capable of illuminating ancient questions in new ways, but not as an authority, and not as a replacement for the kind of sustained personal engagement with evidence and argument and experience that questions of this magnitude actually require. What makes this entire episode genuinely significant is not the answer Grok gave. It is what the response to Grok's answer reveals about us, about how desperately people on every side of the religious debate are searching for some external validation of what they already believe or already doubt. Christians who shared the viral clips wanted the machine to confirm their faith. Atheists who were unsettled by those clips wanted the machine to confirm their skepticism. Both groups were looking for a verdict from outside themselves. But the question of who Jesus was and whether he rose from the dead has never been a question that data alone can settle. It sits at the exact intersection of history and philosophy and personal experience and ultimately choice. What Grok did in its most remarkable moments was not answer the question. It illuminated it. It cleared away the lazy dismissals on both sides. It forced the evidence into the open and said, here is what we know, here is what we cannot know, here is what each position requires you to account for, and here is where the honest weight of the available evidence leans. And then it stepped back. Because that is where the machine's domain ends and yours begins. 2,000 years ago, a question was spoken in a garden outside Jerusalem. But Grok is not a preacher. It is not an apologist. And a machine genuinely committed to rigorous inquiry cannot present one side of a historical argument and call it analysis. So it also laid out with equal sharpness everything that cuts against the resurrection claim. It noted that no outside sources, no Roman documents, no Jewish records, no neutral contemporary accounts, confirm the resurrection itself. The accounts come entirely from within the community of believers. Grok didn't dismiss this, but it stated it plainly, without softening it for either audience. It laid out the theft theory. Someone moved or stole the body. The tomb was guarded, but guards are human, and Roman soldiers were historically corruptible. The Gospel of Matthew itself records that Jewish authorities bribed soldiers to spread the story that the disciples had stolen the body while the guards slept. Grok found something genuinely interesting in that detail. The fact that this counter-narrative exists within the text itself suggests that the question of the empty tomb was being actively and publicly debated very early, which means the early Christian community was not making claims in a vacuum of indifference. People were pushing back. People were offering alternative explanations. The movement survived that pushback. It laid out the swoon theory, the idea that Jesus did not actually die on the cross, that he lost consciousness, was prematurely declared dead, and revived in the tomb. Grok ran the medical analysis with clinical directness. Roman crucifixion was not an improvised execution method. It was a system engineered by people who killed for a living, refined over centuries specifically to ensure death and to maximize public suffering as a deterrent. The scourging alone, the brutal flogging administered before the crucifixion, was calibrated to push the human body to the edge of survival. Then the nails, then hours suspended on the cross with the specific physiological mechanics of crucifixion designed to make breathing progressively impossible. And then when the soldiers came to check on Jesus and found he appeared already dead, one of them drove a spear into his side. The Gospel of John describes water and blood flowing from the wound, a detail that many medical scholars read as evidence of fluid accumulation around the pericardium, consistent with death from cardiac rupture. Grok's assessment of the swoon theory was unambiguous. It does not survive medical scrutiny. It laid out the hallucination theory. Multiple people in multiple locations over a period of 40 days claimed to see Jesus alive. Could this be a mass psychological experience rooted in grief? Grok took this seriously. It acknowledged that psychology does document individual grief-related visions. Bereavement hallucinations are real and relatively common in people who have lost someone close to them. But it then pointed to the specific nature of the post-resurrection accounts. These are not vague spiritual impressions or feelings of presence. They are accounts of conversations, of meals, of physical contact. Thomas being explicitly invited to put his fingers into the wounds, the disciples eating fish with Jesus by the lake at dawn. These are sensory, specific, material, and durable claims. Grok noted that group hallucinations of this specificity, consistency, and duration across multiple separate appearances involving different people in different places. Das Pomosioes have no established precedent in the psychological literature. The theory requires more to be true than the evidence for it can currently support. Then Grok brought in something that even many serious religious people have never encountered: the criterion of embarrassment. This is a methodology used by historians across disciplines, not just biblical scholars, that asks a simple question about any ancient text. Would the writers have invented this detail? Or is it more plausible that they preserved it precisely because it actually happened, regardless of how inconvenient it was for their purposes? The resurrection accounts in all four Gospels are full of details that fail that test. Most significantly, in all four accounts, the first witnesses to the empty tomb and the first people to encounter the risen Jesus are women. In first century Jewish and Roman culture, women's testimony carried virtually no legal or social weight. They were not considered reliable witnesses in a court of law. If you were constructing a resurrection narrative designed to persuade a first century audience, you would not begin it with women. You would begin it with Peter, this recognized leader of the disciples, standing triumphantly at the empty tomb. The fact that all four Gospels independently and consistently place women as the primary witnesses, despite this being culturally counterproductive and rhetorically disadvantageous, is a mark in favor of the accounts, reflecting something that actually occurred rather than something that was strategically fabricated. By this point in the viral conversation, people on every side of the debate were stunned, not because Grok had proved the resurrection. It hadn't, and no one and nothing can prove or disprove it with the tools currently available, but because a machine had engaged with the question at a level of intellectual depth, nuance, and genuine fairness that most human discussions of this topic never reach. It had not performed atheism. It had not performed Christianity. It had performed something considerably rarer. Genuine, rigorous, honest inquiry that took both the evidence and the counter-evidence seriously and followed the logic wherever it led without deciding in advance where it should go. But the story of Grok and religion does not stop with the Jesus question. Because around the same time, users were testing Grok on the Bible itself, specifically on a parent